Lesson 12. Practical Reflections from Africa. This book is an attempt to organize the experiences I gathered in Africa. It is a record of observations, facts, and situations of which I was a direct witness, as well as an effort to understand their meaning years later. I did not go there with the intention of treating depression. At that time, I had almost no theoretical background in psychiatry or psychology. I functioned almost exclusively in the realm of practice and Buddhist ideology, consciously pushing matters of the human psyche into the background. I arrived in Tanzania largely by chance. In 2020, the world was engulfed by the pandemic and the atmosphere of collective psychosis that accompanied it. The first lockdown found me in India, in the small village of Fadapu, where I ran a modest Buddhist temple. I performed simple religious rituals there, taught children English, and supported the local community with modest means provided by my acquaintances through social media. I myself lived in very austere conditions. I slept on a stone floor in the only roofed room of the temple. The formal ban on leaving one's place of residence, on which, in Buddhist practice, obtaining food depends, completely disrupted monastic daily life. When the world began closing down again that autumn, I boarded a plane to Tanzania without much deliberation, one of the few countries that openly opposed the restrictions imposed by the WHO. After arriving, I almost immediately began cooperating with a local orphanage in Dar es Salaam. I organized symbolic material assistance and spent time with the children. At the same time, I traveled around the country, taking advantage of the fact that Tanzania had not introduced internal restrictions. I walked the Kilimanjaro Massif, the island of Zanzibar, and Mafia Island on foot, reaching wild, secluded places far from tourist routes. During a short restorative stay by Lake Tanganyika, the local community showed me a shelter run by the Brothers of Charity. I was invited to stay longer, and I accepted. Kigoma became my refuge for the next 2 years. At the shelter I conducted art classes, taught children English, worked with young people by motivating them toward vocational activation, and led simple practical training sessions. My missionary activity was described on social media, which provided both visibility and funds for subsequent initiatives. Over time, people began to join me who were seeking an escape from lives that no longer satisfied them. Volunteers appeared to help with work with children and youth, both at the shelter in Kigoma and at the orphanage in Dar es Salaam. These were often individuals immersed in depression and not infrequently also struggling with addictions. I did not conduct formal therapy with them. At the same time, experiences I had gained earlier in Thailand, where I helped at an addiction treatment center, proved surprisingly useful in practice and were applied spontaneously, without theoretical frameworks. 1. The unconscious beginning of therapeutic services. By abandoning my previous life and entering a Buddhist order, I took a step typical of people struggling with psychological problems. However, it took me several more years of life to become aware of this. At the time, I did not perceive the decision in that way. I felt a strong need for change, and life led me precisely in that direction. I attributed it to a desire for adventure, for new experiences, and for confronting new challenges. In reality, such a radical cut, abandoning a well-functioning business and handing it over to employees, was the consequence of a disorganization of psychological capacities and logical thinking. I justified this decision with a narrative suggested by Buddhist philosophy. The Buddha abandoned a comfortable life in a palace for a seemingly purposeless wandering, whose meaning was to be the attainment of mythical enlightenment. Buddhist doctrine allowed me to shift the burden of responsibility onto a newly chosen path, while in fact this was an expression of an unrecognized psychological breakdown. As a result, I became my own first patient in the therapy of depression, at that stage still completely unaware of both the illness itself and the therapeutic process that was just beginning. Today, having come to understand the mechanisms governing the human psyche, those events arrange themselves into an almost textbook pattern. In searching for a lost sense of meaning, I instinctively entered a therapeutic process without yet making a conscious self-diagnosis. Over time, I recognized the same mechanism in my volunteers. They do not join me solely out of selfless willingness to help. Their subconscious signals a need for therapy, directing them toward me. Some already have a diagnosis of depression, often hidden from their surroundings, but the vast majority are not yet aware of their own psychological crisis. It can therefore be assumed that the human psyche is capable of subconsciously sensing a disturbance and initiating a search for an external form of help. Thanks to this process, an initial depression does not always develop into a clinical form. People instinctively seek an alternative to conditions in which they feel unfulfilled, overwhelmed, or unhappy. Taking up volunteering can, in this context, serve as a safety valve, a way to stabilize a dysregulated psyche and an attempt to rediscover meaning lost somewhere along the way. The more I reflect on this, the more it points to the existence of an instinctive, self-preserving repair mechanism. A great many people who contacted me about the possibility of coming to support the facilities in which I work turned out to have milder or deeper psychological problems, often ones they themselves were not aware of. Depression is not an exceptional phenomenon in contemporary society. Almost everyone experiences periods of low mood in life. There are also stages particularly predisposed to the emergence of psychological crises. One of them is entering adulthood, which involves assuming responsibilities for which the psyche is not always sufficiently mature. Another sensitive period is leaving adulthood, when children begin to become independent and the parental role gradually fades. A third critical moment appears with the diminishing of a social role at retirement age. These natural stages of life favor psychological crises and not infrequently lead to breakdowns resulting in depression. Unconscious searching for a remedy is therefore a typical element of human experience, even when we do not yet name that state depression. 2. Shifting the center of attention. Helping others has a therapeutic effect because it confronts a person with problems that are real, objective, and often extreme. Identity crises, burnout, or depression are painful experiences, yet they very often grow on a cognitively unstable foundation. A mind deprived of external points of reference begins to magnify its own difficulties disproportionately, granting them the status of a catastrophe. Helping another person abruptly interrupts this mechanism. For one person, a divorce means the total collapse of the world, the devaluation of plans, dreams, and a sense of meaning. For another, it becomes simply another stage of life, often more mature, calmer, and ultimately happier. In a new relationship, unrealistic expectations no longer appear, the bond becomes less conflict-ridden, based on compromise and complementary competencies, and thus qualitatively more mature. The difference does not lie in the event itself, but in its interpretation and in the time needed for wounds to heal. Depression very often arises precisely at this stage, when a temporary crisis is recognized by the mind as a permanent and irreversible condition. Many depressive episodes are transient in nature, yet in isolation and self-absorption they grow to disproportionate size. Working in the addiction treatment environment at Thamkrabok showed me the scale of human tragedies that do not lend themselves to such relativization. Families watching the slow degradation of their loved ones, mothers finding their intoxicated children and being left without any tools to help, finally, the funerals of young people whose undiagnosed depression ended in death. In such a context, one's own suffering ceases to be the sole point of reference. The therapeutic mechanism is activated at the moment attention shifts. The mind of a person with depression is pathologically turned inward, constantly analyzing, judging, and blaming itself. Contact with the real suffering of other people tears it out of this closed loop. Observing the misfortune of others does not lead to numbness, but to a correction of perspective. Suffering ceases to be abstract and no longer revolves exclusively around one's own self. At Thamkrabok, I saw fallen people for whom getting back on their feet seemed impossible. On the one hand, they were helped by the monastery's restrictions and discipline, on the other, by being shown an alternative, contact with nature, meditation in unconventional places, long walks, and conversations about philosophy and culture. A change of environment and narrative did not cure addictions directly, but it loosened the mental pattern built on hopelessness. The same mechanism worked on me as well. In India, I experienced extreme deprivation, absolute poverty, where daily life means a lack of food and water. The pandemic lockdown brutally exposed systemic injustice, entire families dying of hunger while restrictions were enforced by a ruling class protecting itself. Confrontation with a real threat to life acted like a cognitive sobering. The mind no longer had space to cultivate its own neurotic narratives. I observed the same effect among volunteers working in Tanzania. Children sleeping on sidewalks, begging for food, spending nights in cemeteries, these are experiences that violently pull thinking out of self-referential tracks. In contact with such a world, concentration on one's own suffering becomes almost impossible. Not because the pain disappears, but because a more urgent object of attention appears. Children clung to volunteers, hungry for warmth and presence. Sending them back to the streets in the evenings was painful, yet it simultaneously triggered a process that depression cannot tolerate: action. The mind stopped flagellating itself. It began to plan, to seek solutions, to organize help. A sense of agency emerged. This is the essence of the therapeutic mechanism. Depression takes away the sense of influence and meaning. Volunteering restores it, not through affirmations or autosuggestion, but through the direct experience of being needed. Even small successes generate a strong neurochemical response. The mind, previously suspended in a void, regains orientation. My actions matter, my presence makes a difference. Although it may sound paradoxical, the misfortune of some became salvation for others. Working with street children very quickly helped people struggling with depression get back on their feet. The children gave volunteers energy to act, forced them to plan, to actively seek solutions, and to establish contact with people who could provide financial help. Even modest successes triggered powerful releases of endorphins. This was not an artificially induced sense of worth, but something directly lived and genuinely felt. 3. Children as beings outside the narrative. Volunteering with different groups of people generates different challenges. Alcoholics and drug addicts are often highly skilled manipulators. Their reactions, reported problems, and emotional states are frequently performances directed at the caregiver, roles they play in order to gain tangible benefits for themselves. The addiction environment is extremely demanding. It requires great reserves of patience and a highly developed assertiveness. In addiction treatment centers, staff and volunteers operate according to established rules designed to reduce opportunities for manipulating caregivers. The emotions and reactions presented by patients can be perfectly convincing, often because the addicted person truly believes in their own narrative. This makes giving in to them exceptionally easy. At the same time, addicted individuals fall into the trap of their own manipulations. Repeated lying, deception, and manipulation lead caregivers to develop a higher level of emotional numbness. Reported discomfort may be ignored, even when it is, for example, a symptom of a serious illness. In my practice, I observe that constant lying and exaggeration of symptoms leads to those signals being dismissed precisely at moments when they should be taken seriously. Unfortunately, this can even result in a patient's death, which does in fact happen. Caring for an addicted person requires 5 times as many responses as caring for a non-addicted person. 4 out of those 5 reports do not require intervention, as they are merely attempts to attract attention or gain some privilege. For this reason, I strongly discourage this form of volunteering for people with weak boundaries, those who have very high empathy, are overly trusting, and show an excessive eagerness to help. A second group, far more rewarding, consists of elderly people or those in terminal conditions. They usually do not manipulate caregivers, and the only mask they wear is a mannerism used to conceal their inner pain. When physical pain intensifies or when awareness of old age or impending death becomes difficult to accept, irritability, bitterness, and excessive demands for attention may appear. These are not manipulations aimed at gaining external benefits, but attempts to draw attention and restore a sense of personal value. Elderly people often need this kind of attention, especially in nursing homes, where they frequently feel abandoned and unnecessary. In such cases, patience and an empathetic approach are essential. Understanding the uniqueness and hopelessness of their life situation provides deep reserves of patience and gentleness. In caring for the elderly, the ability to listen is crucial. Often, their stories are the only thing they are still able to offer the world. Allowing them to speak freely has therapeutic value both for them and for the volunteer, who, by comparing another person's life story with their own internal struggles, shifts the center of gravity of their inner narrative. The most rewarding, yet at the same time the most demanding, is contact with a child. A child usually has no developed mannerisms yet, their view of the world is narrow, and their manipulations are naive, limited to wanting to spend time together or trying to obtain treats. Children also have an instinctive need to be protected, which manifests as a very low threshold of trust. They form attachments very easily, seeking quasi-parental affection from the caregiver. Such a bond develops quickly, resembling the relationship between a parent and a child. This is particularly evident in orphanages. Children are pure in their relationships. Their narrative is a search for support, care, and trust. It is most often not yet distorted by the environment. Such distortions typically appear only in adolescence. Additionally, children from shelters and orphanages in third world countries live in mercilessly difficult material conditions. This amplifies empathy and the desire to help. A child's naivety and need for closeness are an extraordinarily powerful source of energy that redirects attention away from oneself. The volunteer focuses all their attention on helping the child. 4. Different groups, different mechanisms. Volunteering with different groups of people generates entirely different psychological challenges. Each of these groups activates distinct relational mechanisms, evokes different emotional responses in the caregiver, and carries different therapeutic risks. People with addictions, a relationship based on a game. Alcoholics and drug addicts are usually highly skilled manipulators. From the perspective of clinical psychology, this is not a character flaw but a learned adaptive mechanism. Addiction forces constant circumvention of limits, acquisition of resources, and maintenance of access to substances. As a result, a relational personality structure based on the game develops. The problems reported by addicted individuals, their emotional states, or sudden crises are often performances directed at the caregiver. The goal of this role-playing is not emotional relief, but obtaining concrete benefits, privileges, concessions, special treatment, or reduced control. Importantly, these emotions can be extremely convincing because the addicted person often truly believes in them. Defense mechanisms, rationalization, denial, and projection make the narrative subjectively true for the person experiencing it. For this reason, the addiction environment is one of the most demanding areas of volunteering. In addiction treatment centers, staff operate according to strictly defined rules whose primary purpose is to limit the possibility of manipulating the therapeutic relationship. Without such a framework, the relationship quickly becomes distorted. There is, however, a second, much darker side to this mechanism. Persistent lying, exaggeration, and attempts at manipulation lead caregivers to develop increasing emotional numbness. Over time, real warning signals may be ignored because this has happened before or this is just another attempt to provoke a reaction. In my practice, I have repeatedly observed situations in which a genuine, serious health problem was dismissed precisely because the patient had previously abused attention many times. In some cases, this leads to tragic consequences, including the patient's death. Caring for an addicted person requires incomparably more energy than caring for a non-addicted person. Out of 5 reported issues, 4 do not require real intervention. They are merely attempts at emotional regulation or attention-seeking. For this reason, I strongly advise against this form of volunteering for people with very high empathy, low assertiveness, and a tendency toward over-responsibility. It is psychologically draining and promotes secondary traumatization. Elderly and terminally ill people. The need to be seen working with elderly or terminally ill individuals looks entirely different. Manipulation is rare in this group, and when it does appear, it is not instrumental in nature. Most often it takes the form of a mannerism, a mask behind which fear, pain, or a sense of lost value is hidden. From a clinical perspective, behaviors such as irritability, fault-finding, or excessive demands for attention are attempts to regulate the sense of existence. Elderly people, especially those living in care homes, often experience a profound sense of abandonment and uselessness. Their need for attention is not an attempt to control the caregiver, but a desperate cry, "I am still here." In such relationships, the ability to listen is crucial. Life stories are often the only resource these individuals can still offer the world. Allowing them to speak serves a therapeutic function, both for them and for the volunteer. Comparing another person's life path with one's own struggles leads to a natural correction of perspective and a shift in the center of gravity of the inner narrative. The child, a relationship based on pure attachment, the most rewarding, yet at the same time the most demanding, area of volunteering is contact with a child. A child usually has not yet developed social mannerisms or complex defense mechanisms. Their perception of the world is narrow, and any attempts at manipulation are naive, limited to requests for shared time or small pleasures such as sweets. Children also display an instinctive need to be protected, which manifests as a very low threshold of trust. At the same time, they form attachments easily, expecting quasi-parental closeness from the caregiver. Unlike adults, they do not yet possess elaborate defense mechanisms or social masks. Their world is brutally simplified: hunger, lack of safety, lack of care, lack of a future. This is particularly evident in orphanages. A relationship resembling the bond between a parent and a child forms very quickly there. Children are pure in their relationships. Their narrative is not a social game, but a search for support, care, and trust. Most often, it has not yet been distorted by the environment. Such distortions tend to appear only in adolescence. From the perspective of clinical psychology, we are dealing here with a primary attachment relationship that has been interrupted or never fully formed. This is why the threshold of trust is low, and yet attachment, once it appears, is extremely rapid and intense. A child clings to the caregiver not in order to gain something, but because they biologically need a protective figure. In addition, children from shelters and orphanages in so-called third world countries live in extremely harsh living conditions, compounded by severe deprivation. Children sleeping on the streets, in cemeteries, under shop awnings, deprived of regular meals and any form of medical care, function in a state of constant threat. Contact with them acts on the volunteer like a brutal cognitive reset. In the face of a child's real suffering, one's own problems lose their status as absolute. This amplifies empathy and the natural urge to help on the part of the volunteer. A child's naivete and need for closeness become an extraordinarily powerful stimulus that effectively redirects attention away from the self. The volunteer focuses all their energy on the child and their needs. It is precisely this straightforwardness and lack of hidden narrative that activate the key therapeutic mechanism here. A child does not put on a social mask because they are not yet aware of its existence. The mind of a person with depression, previously obsessively focused on itself, is violently pulled out of this loop. Attention shifts to concrete realities: how to feed the child, where they can sleep, whom to notify, how to obtain help. Depressive self-reflection is replaced by action. Moreover, when the caregiver experiences acceptance that does not require any role, they too stop wearing one. The relationship becomes honest and direct, and the emotional connection mutual. Children also possess an exceptionally sensitive emotional intuition. They respond to the caregiver's mental states. They sense sadness in their voice, tension, joy, or fatigue, and subconsciously respond in an appropriate way. When a caregiver is depressed, a child may simply come over and hug them without any calculation. In this way, a sense of psychological connection emerges, which has a very positive effect on a person suffering from depression. From a psychological perspective, this is direct affect regulation through contact, a primary mechanism that is often no longer accessible in adults. Sending children back in the evening to the street, to a cemetery, or to an environment that does not protect them is a deeply painful experience. Paradoxically, however, it is precisely this pain that has a therapeutic effect. The mind stops flagellating itself with feelings of worthlessness and begins to search for real solutions. A sense of meaning appears, based not on narrative but on fact. Someone cannot manage without me. Under such conditions, a sense of self-worth is neither suggested nor built on auto-suggestion. It is directly experienced. The child responds to the caregiver's presence immediately and unequivocally. For a person with depression, this is one of the strongest possible signals: I am needed here and now. 5. Provisional structures and the lack of clear boundaries. In conversations with potential volunteers, a recurring question concerns what I, or the organization I represent, can offer to volunteers. This question is most often asked by people who have had no prior contact with volunteering, and even less so with volunteering in so-called third world countries. It is therefore worth addressing this issue directly. Volunteering is not a business activity. It is rather a response to the very urgent needs of a given organization. Facilities lack staff, cleaning supplies, and often even food. In third world countries, most institutions are sustained entirely by local donations, which are disproportionately small in relation to real needs. In a typical Tanzanian orphanage, children's rooms are overcrowded. Several children sleep in one bed, and it is not uncommon for some to sleep on the floor. Providing a separate room for a volunteer is often simply impossible. Food in orphanages and shelters falls far below European standards, both in terms of variety and quantity. Relying solely on what the facility provides may be satisfactory only for people struggling with obesity and wishing to lose weight quickly. The same applies to sanitation facilities, which very often consist of nothing more than a hole in the floor. For this reason, a volunteer should be prepared to rent a room or apartment near the facility. This also applies to food. Providing accommodation on the orphanage grounds is not only organizationally difficult, but could also have a very destructive effect on the volunteer's motivation. The local community is accustomed to a very low standard of living. A visiting European is unlikely to cope well with functioning under such conditions. Orphanages and shelters operate on extremely modest budgets, from which they attempt to cover basic needs such as food, electricity, and water. All other expenses are tightly rationed. A volunteer is not a key element of the facility's functioning, so their needs either fall to the background or are not considered at all. One should therefore be prepared for the fact that the institution will provide the volunteer with virtually nothing. In a typical orphanage, children spend the day at school. During this time, organizational tasks such as laundry, cleaning, and cooking are carried out. Only a few children require care, those who are temporarily unwell or not yet of school age. Meanwhile, volunteers often imagine work in an orphanage or shelter as involving constant contact with children. In Tanzania, for example, children leave the orphanage early in the morning, at dawn, and return only before dusk. During the day, the compound remains almost empty. Evenings are devoted to washing, dinner, and homework. There is very little time for play with caregivers. Only weekends and holidays are more relaxed. This is one of the most common misunderstandings in discussions about volunteering. In working days, there are simply no children in the shelter. In third world cultures, there is a system of care in which older siblings look after younger ones. In orphanages and shelters, this model is adopted and extended to the entire community. Older children wash clothes, clean, help cook, wash dishes, and change infants. They take on many adult roles that are lacking in the community. In poor countries, there is no tradition of disinterested volunteering in the Western sense of the term. Local volunteers are usually more or less distant relatives of the children placed in the facility, families that themselves are unable to provide even minimal social support. They help with the orphanage work and may sometimes receive a meal in return. However, they are not staff members subject to the facility's management. It is the children who perform a significant portion of the work required to keep the orphanage running. As a result, the division of roles and responsibilities is created ad hoc, depending on current needs and the availability of people. When potential volunteers ask me to define such a division, it is difficult to do so precisely. An orphanage is not a school. It is rather a dormitory and a canteen. There are no regular activities organized for children, and space for play is largely limited to days off from school. It should also be emphasized that local law does not allow care facilities to keep children on their premises during school hours. Public education is compulsory, and organizing any activities outside of school during this time is illegal, even the distribution of free meals. A volunteer's activities must therefore be subordinated to local regulations, even if from a European perspective they may seem illogical or harsh. Summary. Lesson 12 brings the theme of treating depression through the caregiving relationship to a close, presenting it as a process rooted in real experience rather than theoretical assumptions. Volunteering, especially in third world countries, functions here as a natural mechanism regulating the psyche, often activated even before it is recognized or named as therapy. The starting point is a personal experience of an identity crisis which, in retrospect, reveals itself as an early, unconscious stage of depression. Radical life decisions found their justification in Buddhist philosophy, which was not the cause of the crisis but rather a framework that made it possible to endure. Only later did it become clear that this was a form of self-healing based on action rather than analysis. The key therapeutic mechanism proved to be the shift of attention away from one's own inner experiences toward the real needs of other people. Contact with the suffering of people struggling with addiction, with the elderly, and with children living in extreme deprivation effectively interrupts the depressive loop of self-referential thinking. The mind stops revolving around itself and is compelled to respond to concrete situations. A particularly important role is played by relationships with children in third world countries. Their reality, hunger, lack of safety, and lack of care imposes meaning in a direct and non-negotiable way. A child does not expect narrative or reflection, but presence and protection. This simplicity of relationship, free from masks and social games, makes it an exceptionally effective therapeutic tool. Lesson 12 also shows that volunteering is not a form of self-fulfillment or comfort. It operates under conditions of scarcity and limitation, and the volunteer's needs are not a priority. This confrontation with reality has a therapeutic effect in itself. It shatters illusions and shifts the center of gravity from expectations to responsibility. The final conclusion of this lesson is simple: depression does not always require deep introspection. Often, stepping outside one's own narrative and entering a relationship in which meaning, responsibility, and action are imposed from the outside proves more effective. The caregiving relationship does not eliminate suffering, but it changes its direction, and it is in this shift that its therapeutic power lies.